Welcome to our Lunch and Learn web series. I'm Andrew Williamson. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the program manager for the Sustainable Workforce Coalition, which is part of ZEIC, the Zero Emissions Innovation Center. We're calling in today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. And our format for this Lunch and Learn series is 1 hour. And we'll start with some introductions and then hear from both of our guests. And when their presentations have concluded, open it up to a roundtable discussion with one of our co-hosts. I'd like to say thank you to Stefan von Silke and Janet Andrews for joining us here today. And so I'll pass it over to Janet. She's the Secretary Treasurer of the New Westminster and District Labour Council. And bon appetit, feel free to eat while we go.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And again, I'm Janet Andrews. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm with the New Westminster and District Labour Council. We're very pleased to co-host with SWC and the Vancouver and District Labour Council this ongoing series of lunch and learns to really get that community and labour conversation around a just transition. What does the future of jobs look like? How do we get to net zero in a practical way? And so really excited to be here today to hear from two guests, and then we're going to have a moderated discussion after. So Alex Callahan is with the Canadian Labour Congress, that is Canada's voice for workers at the federal level. It's about 3.3 million members, and he is the Director of Health, Safety and the Environment there. And Megan Gordon joins us this morning from the Pembina Institute. She is the author of a Sustainable Jobs Blueprint with the Pembina Institute. And we're really excited to hear this discussion, and they're going to share some thoughts with us. And then following that, Stefan von Sychowski will step in and moderate a panel discussion. So we'll kick it off here and relax. Feel free to eat your lunch with your camera off. And we're really excited to learn more about the tripartite approach to a just transition. Alex and Megan, take it away.
Hi, my name is Alex Callahan. I'm the National Director of Health, Safety and Environment at the CLC, and I want to start by thanking Andrew and Janet and Stefan for the opportunity to speak to folks today. This is a welcome opportunity. So I'm going to indulge me for 1 second while I pull up a deck, and I will start. Okay, the real question is, Callahan, can you find your screen share button? Here we go. Yes, we can. Okay, so what is just transition and sustainable jobs? So the term just transition originates with the trade union movement. It's generally attributed to a steelworker from the United States named Tony Mazzocchi. And the idea is that as countries, as the world sort of adapts to and mitigates environmental challenges, workers need to be at the table to discuss what this means for them and to be bargaining in terms of what this means going forward, and to address the needs of workers and communities in an ongoing way. And so the issue or the principle has been around for some time, but it really sort of started to get going as climate became an increasingly important issue. And so in 2013, the International Labour Conference adopted a resolution to set guidelines for just transition. And that fits into the International Labour Organization, which is a UN body that it's a tripartite body that includes representation from governments, from workers, and from employers. And Canada's been a member of the ILO since 1919. We're a founding member of the organization. And so in 2015, the ILO published guidelines on what they called a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all. And the purpose of this was to give advice to social partners. And social partners are governments, employers, and worker representatives. But it's not ratified like an ILO convention, so it's advice. And we take it pretty seriously because it's ILO statements and ILO guidelines reflect consensus between social partners. So as this is happening at the ILO in 2015, the Paris Agreement includes just transition in the Paris Agreement. And so in the preamble, it says that parties should take into account the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work, quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined priorities. So it's an important roadmark. Canada is a signatory to Paris, and this is binding. And so as this is happening, Canada is also beginning to do work domestically. And so in 2017, Canada co-founds the Powering Past Coal Alliance, COP23 in Bonn. And as a result of some of the work that the CLC was able to do and trade unions more broadly, the Powering Past Coal Alliance included a commitment to just transition. And Canada joined that coalition at the same time as they established a task force on just transition for Canadian coal workers in 2018. And this went around and spoke to workers, spoke to communities, spoke to employers, specifically related to coal phase outs. Now, the report is excellent and the recommendations are excellent. They have not all been followed, and it's a bit of a source of frustration for a lot of folks. So I would describe that as a mixed success. Further in this context, 2019, the Liberals commit to a Just Transition Act, and they commit again in 2021. And then as the Supply and Confidence Agreement comes in, this becomes a pillar of the Supply and Confidence Agreement between the Liberals and New Democrats. And so we end up, oh, can I get my slides to go? Yeah, here we go, with something called the Sustainable Jobs Act, which is tabled in June 2023. And so what is the Sustainable Jobs Act? It is a framework for thinking about just transition going forward. It's goals, it's a structure, and it creates a forum for national social dialogue. And it sets out pretty helpfully that the purpose is to, quote, facilitate and promote economic growth, the creation of sustainable jobs, and support for workers and communities in Canada and the shift to a net zero economy. From our perspective, it creates a forum for national social dialogue, for that tripartite discussion. It's actually slightly broader than tripartite in this instance, but it sets forward that workers have a seat at the table in terms of determining what work and what the economy is going to look like in a net zero economy. This is a big positive. The other thing that it does is it requires a 5-year jobs planning cycle that's developed with advice. With advice through social dialogue. So when I say social dialogue in this context, it's through something called the Sustainable Jobs Partnership Council that's being established. And so so that Partnership Council provides advice to create a 5-year planning cycle for jobs, the Sustainable Jobs Action Plans, and those match up with the emissions reductions plans. And then the legislation also sets up a secretariat within the government. So this is sort of it's a reflection of some of the work that's in the Net Zero Emissions Act. And this is what happens to the economy as Canada decarbonizes. What happens to our economy? What happens to workers? And how can we seize the opportunities presented in there, in particular to make sure that a net zero economy is founded on good, safe, unionized jobs, that we don't see a degradation in the quality of work because we're meeting climate targets. We can meet climate targets, meet our climate ambition, and create good jobs and prosperity for workers. So this legislation is tabled. It's a good start, and trade unions and the CLC coordinate our activity to lobby for some changes and improvements to the bill. And I think the biggest one is that the bill that there's an amendment made to define what a sustainable job is. And it means, and I'm going to quote here again, a job that's compatible with Canada's pathway to achieving net zero emissions and climate resilient future, and that reflects the concept of decent work. Decent work is, again, it's an important ILO concept, something I can come back to if there's an interest in discussing it later. The concept of decent work, namely work, including a job in which a worker is represented by a trade union that's entered into a collective agreement and can support the worker, their family over time, and includes elements of fair income, job security, social protection, and social dialogue. So this says we want this legislation is meant to be planning a future based on good jobs. Jobs are important, but this is good jobs with good pay, benefits, collective bargaining. The other amendment that we were able to move through was to formalize the role for trade unions on the Partnership Council. We pushed very hard for formalizing that, and so 4 of the 13 seats on the Partnership Council will be worker representatives. The other improvement was so initially when the bill was tabled, it was very much focused on the idea that this was going to be about creating good new jobs, which is excellent. We were able to push to add language that says workers in high emitting jobs need pathways into low emitting jobs. So if people are changing the industry in which they're working, they need support, they need training, they need employment and income supports, and the action plans are now meant to address that. We also talk about now the action plans will talk about industrial decarbonization. So there's a lot of industries excuse me, that are carbon intensive, but are essential to our economy and to sort of our national, social fabric. Think of steel, cement, forestry, agri-food and agriculture, as transportation, as some of the examples. The action plans now will take into account industrial decarbonization as well, so that a good union job in those industries can be protected. Because frankly, the simplest way for somebody to have a sustainable job is to enter into a sustainable job is for their job to become sustainable, right? It's a good union job and we are able to decarbonize it. We're able to push and to negotiate around its decarbonization, and people keep their paycheck, they keep their pension, they keep where they work. That's a pretty good solution. I will mention what the sustainable job is not, because it's not the entire package right now. It is not investments in training or in jobs or in like infrastructure and things like that. These are the sorts of things that I think we're going to be looking for in the action plans going forward, and why it's really important that workers have a voice at the Partnership Council and in the development of the action plans. I will also note, though, that there's room outside of the action plans for progress towards achieving sort of sustainable jobs. And you can see that for example, some of the work that the government's done on investment tax credits for clean industry. And they, for the first time, and this is again as a result of the coordinated push from labor, have included prevailing wage requirements. So in the United States, for a long time, public procurement was contingent on contractors paying their workers either a union wage or the equivalent of a union wage. And that hasn't existed in Canada. And so now for clean electricity tax credit, CCUS, clean hydrogen, there are labor standards that go along with this, which include the equivalent of a union wage, or even better, a union apprenticeship ratios, things like that, so that these are supporting good jobs. Canada's also doing work around EV supply chains, and of course we need to be vigilant about making sure that this is going to be the work's going to be done by unionized Canadian workers. So where is this at now? The bill was passed by the House of Commons on the 15th of April, and it's now in the Senate. And they've actually just started second reading debate in the Senate, and we're very much hoping to see this move through in a pretty swift fashion. And then things shift to making sure that there's a partnership council in place, and that the sorts of things that will really start some of this investment are in the action plan going forward. So that's sort of the next piece that's going to happen, is actually getting down to the nitty gritty of social dialogue, of that sort of tripartite negotiation. And I should also mention here that that what I've talked about is very sort of high level in respect of sort of tripartism and in terms of this sort of policy direction. The ILO guidelines, and frankly the view of labor, is that this does not stop and start at that national body. Just transition is going to take place, or the sort of transition to sustainable jobs is going to take place everywhere from this national policy level to regional levels to the shop floor and to negotiations that are happening in all kinds of workplaces. And it is absolutely essential for workers to have a voice in their future. Nothing about us without us, and to be bargaining what this looks like, to make sure that workers have the skills they need, to make sure that they have the protections they need, that their wages are secure, that their pensions are secure, and that frankly, an economy can be sustainable. And that really does mean two things. It does mean economic sustainability and viability for workers. These have to be good jobs, and also environmental sustainability. For a long time, the trade union movement talked about there are no jobs on a dead planet, and that's true. So we know we need to do these things. But we know that as our economy transitions, it cannot happen at the expense of working people. And so this is a very high level sort of overview of where we're at, of the ways in which unions and labor need to be at the table, and why the ways in which Canada has sort of committed to these principles, and how we can kind of put these things into action. And so I'd like to thank you for your time. I'm looking forward to the discussion that Stefan's going to moderate shortly, and I'll hand it back. I'm not sure if I'm handing it directly off to Megan or if I'm handing it back to Andrew.
Yes, Megan, take it over. Thank you.
Sorry, everybody, just bear with me as I get this set up here. Okay. Um, so thanks so much, Alex. Thanks to the team here for providing the opportunity to speak. My name is Megan Gordon. I'm a senior analyst with the Pembina Institute. If you're not familiar with Pembina, we're a national charity clean energy think tank headquartered out of Calgary, Alberta. I'm a senior analyst on what we call the equitable transition team, who looks at some of the socioeconomic aspects of a clean energy transition. And one of our major projects last year, we had the pleasure of working with the Canadian Labour Congress and Alex himself on what we are calling our Sustainable Jobs Blueprint series. So essentially, this project kicked off in 2022, where the CLC and Pembina came together to ask ourselves the question, what would make the transition to net zero fair for workers? And so this work involved a number of different inputs. We undertook a scan of global best practices to identify key themes in just transition policies. So I do use the terminology sustainable jobs and just transition interchangeably. So essentially this meant looking at other countries who are undergoing similar kinds of shifts, have similar commitments when it comes to climate change, and looking at the kind of interventions they put in place to support their workers. We also met with workers through interviews, focus groups, and we undertook a polling exercise with specifically unionized workers in high emitting sectors to test their attitudes towards different kinds of transition policy options. We undertook some economic modeling to look at different kinds of policy interventions and determine how the impact would be on our economy and our workforce if we were to achieve net zero. And we also met with other policy experts to help us craft a set of policy recommendations specifically aimed at the federal government. And like Alex said, this is something that really needs to occur at all different levels of government and decision-making forums. But the context for this particular series is really looking at what the federal government can do in light of its commitments to put forward the Sustainable Jobs Act and announce different kinds of action plans. So essentially, this report series is what we view to be those key investment and policy interventions that they need to take as first steps in order to put us on the right track to a more fair and worker-centered approach to climate policy. So one of the key things we found for report number 1 was that given that Canada has a largely natural resource-based economy with significant export activities generating GDP, that really means that activities from all over the globe are going to be impacting our economy. And, you know, when we modeled out some of these things, we did find that many of the global shifts that we're seeing in our industries are really, you know, happening from trends outside of Canada's borders. And that's much more affecting levels of employment and workforce transitions than our own domestic policies. So booms and busts in the resource sector is something we're all too familiar with in Canada. And we're finding that, you know, there's only so many things that we can do within our borders to like plan and prepare and mitigate what can happen. So we would find that it is really comes down to social interventions and structuring investments in new industries in ways that we can capitalize on the advantages and our competitive advantage in the clean energy transition, which we're seeing rapidly accelerate around the globe. Things like automation, workforce shortages, global conflict, different business imperatives are all going to have an effect. And so the best thing Canada can do, regardless of where our ambition lies when it comes to our policy around climate change, is to prepare communities and workers for resilience and more preparedness for the future. So we need a much more coordinated approach when it comes to climate, economic, and workforce planning. So when we met with workers, we asked them about their perceptions and level of support for different kind of policy interventions, mainly focused around pensions, employment insurance, training, different kind of investments in new industries, and involving workers in tripartite decision-making like the Partnership Council. We ended up meeting with about 45 workers through interviews and surveyed over 560 workers. What we did find was workers are, you know, not naive to the fact that climate change is really having an influence over what work is going to look like and what kind of industries are viable in the next several decades. And they also were very cognizant of the fact that, government hasn't necessarily planned in advance and put the kinds of supports in place of major changes, whether it be climate change, whether it be things like the cod fishery collapse in the Atlantic Canada. And so they start to see a little bit of that. There's definitely this perception of mistrust when it comes to government's ability to help them prepare and help them mitigate these major economic shifts that occur when some of our industries start to change. That was definitely top of mind for workers. So what we did find was knowing that there could be a potential plan in place for workers did slightly improve their perceptions about climate policy, about the energy transition. When we tested all these different policies, we saw workers generally rate them quite high. But unsurprisingly, the bottom line is workers don't want disruption. They want as much like a smooth and well thought out transition. Many felt that unions were also key actors in upholding those good job standards. And so when we worked with a group called Navius Research, we modeled out different kinds of interventions in a net zero economic model. We wanted to see what exactly was going to happen at macroeconomic indicators like GDP, employment, unemployment levels, different kind of wage impacts when we applied different things like more money for training, better and more robust EI system, pension bridging, and regional investments in affected provinces. So when we sort of flood some money into the places where we expect to see lots of change happening, what happens overall to our economy. And the bottom line is that in a net zero scenario, we still see a lot more jobs created than lost, even without these interventions applied. When we did apply these interventions, it did mitigate some of those key negative impacts for the most affected workers. And overall, in a net zero economy, we do see growth by 1.6 million between 2020 and 2050, which more than offsets potential decline in more fossil fuel-based industries. And that is true even in provinces like Alberta. So when these interventions were applied, we saw growth of GDP by 7 billion by 2050. We showed key sectors with lower unemployment rates, workforces maintained in impacted provinces, so fewer workers moving between different provinces to find job opportunities, and occupations with higher wages and lower unemployment as well. So this piece will kind of get into the advice that we put forward in order to build off of those interventions that we modeled. So this is what we looked at, these trends, these potential impacts, and now turned our attention towards what we think the federal government needs to do in order to help realize and mitigate the worst impacts to workers and actually achieve those job growth numbers. So our report contains about 26 pieces of advice organized into 7 different action areas. And I won't get into each of the 26 pieces. I'll highlight some examples of recommendations where I can. But essentially 4 are focused on providing support for workers, and 3 are more focused on the economy, aimed at job creation and optimizing the potential of our clean economy. So again, it reaches across several different policy areas. It involves updates to existing programs, creation of new programs, and we're also advising that further research engagement be undertaken with labor, potentially through the Partnership Council, which Alex spoke to as one of the key governance measures that'll be created through the Sustainable Jobs Act. So when it comes to our first area, which is investing in skills and training capacity to give workers the tools to succeed, the responsibilities we did find around skills and training do fall to the provinces, but the government does have training programs and there is room for them to take on an enhanced leadership role. So first, we advise the strengthening of the federal training ecosystem. So the programs offered by the federal government need to be scaled up to match the anticipated challenge of transition, which means training about 3 times the number of workers that are currently available for subsidies. And we also recommend that the government review and scale up programs and carve out purpose-built funding to connect workers with sustainable jobs in demand. And that involves more labor market information and analysis, and that being made accessible to decision makers and communities and workers and unions. And in order to match those training subsidies offered to workers, we recommended that there be created a fund for credible nonprofit training institutions and union training centers to actually staff up and deliver those programs. So if we're going to be training a lot more people, we need a lot more training capacity in place to support that. We also underscore the importance of taking a future-oriented view when it comes to recruiting the next generation. Obviously, when we talk about transition, we're talking about, the youth that are going to be in the workforce of tomorrow. So introducing things like a tuition credit that can support youth to join and be directed towards certain fields will help us ensure that we have a workforce that has the skills for our economy in the next 5-10 years into the future. Our next area is providing income security and programs that help workers find new jobs or retire early. So this action area focused around sort of those social security parameters of employment, insurance, workforce agreements, pensions, and resources for workers. And after speaking with workers, we know this is a really vital area where they want to see movement. So when it comes to employment insurance, for example, we underscore the need for our employment insurance system to be modernized to respond to modern challenges. And part of that is putting workers in a better position to move from job to job as transition and change unfolds. And what that looks like specifically is introducing working well on claim provisions. We also note the potential for workforce sharing agreements. These can be applied in industries that are experiencing long-term decline. So for example, we saw the coal sector new regulations introducing a phase out of coal-fired electricity generation by 2030 that has very specific timelines associated with it. We have those facility end dates, and we could use these work sharing agreements to facilitate conversations between employers, Service Canada, and unions to arrange for workers to maybe reduce their hours and retrain while they're not working in advance of the facility closure, rather than what the status quo is, where we often see sort of these like phase layoffs and the sort of slow winding down of certain industries. We think there could be much more intention when it comes to making sure that workers are prepared and reskilled before they actually lose their job. And of course, measures like pension protections, bridging, relocation assistance are also very important for workers who aren't able to find work in their home communities. When it comes to protecting workers' ability to organize and negotiate collective agreements, this really results in cross-sectoral and society-wide benefits. So we looked at, again, making sure that there are those good job, decent job indicators that we see in the jobs that are created. And one of the pathways to that is, reforming some labor laws, which really set the standard for labor standards across Canada, even if it doesn't necessarily apply to a given industry. And making those key changes that result in better wages, benefits, health and safety standards for workers, and amendments to both federal and provincial laws can set the tone for again, non-government regulated occupations. When it comes to engaging workers about their future, we really, after talking to workers, showed there was a gap when it comes to information that was being flowed outward from government decision makers to people on the ground. So there really needs to be that two-way communication, both in sharing perspectives to inform policy through certain measures like the Partnership Council, where we do expect there to be significant labor representation, and also in order for governments to give out information about different paths to net zero and decisions that will impact them. And that is one of the key ways that we expect governments to increase and build trust with communities and workers. Now I'll get into our economy-focused actions. So we had 3 critical asks that are meant to support communities and regions, both broadly in the sense that we anticipate them to require support in response to the influx of changes, but also specifically to communities that will be impacted. So those, again, where we expect to see sectors undergo quite a bit of change as it advances towards net zero. So we note in our asks to make sure that there's strengthened data analysis function to help us determine where those regional impacts will occur. But one of the key recommendations here that we want to highlight is our Futures Fund. So this was something that was actually committed to as part of the emissions reduction plan. This fund would support investments and actions to move forward key industrial policies in certain regions. So really it's just, investing money and giving provinces and regions the capacity to help them plan for new realities, whether that looks like investing in key sectors that are poised for growth, or diversifying their economy to become more resilient to those boom and busts that I spoke to earlier. We also recommend the creation of an economic diversification transfer. And again, that just really helps that sort of place-based community-driven economic diversification projects and community vitality in a much more holistic way. So not only is it just, these big mega projects, but it's things like downtown revitalization, support for entrepreneurs, outdoor recreation. And so communities where we do expect to see changes to their cornerstone industry, whether it be oil and gas, whether it be forestry, they still have livable communities and support to really preserve the health and wellness and keep people there without risking significant outward mobilization. And then this is the last piece I'll touch on. So we discussed this notion of net zero industrial policy in our report. We look at this as a set of strategic government interventions that come together to help us achieve growth in competitive industries that help Canada capitalize on advantages in a global supply chain. So it's really just government using its smart combination of policy tools in order to help certain industries grow and generate those jobs that we expect to see. This really helps also communicate with workers, because it provides a means for Canada to say, these are the industries that we're committed to growing, and here's where you can expect to see job growth along that way. So it helps people plan for that. So an important piece of this involves advancing effective regulations like the clean electricity regulations and an oil and gas cap. And these are important to send the signals to high emitters that they need to decarbonize in order to survive in the current context, and protect the workers and the jobs that they have. As Alex mentioned earlier, decarbonizing in place is one of the best ways to maintain those jobs. So we want to see them become compatible with a net zero scenario. And create that business certainty comes from setting those strong regulations. We also want to see more labor conditions attached to public funding. So if the public is going to fund major projects, we want to see a maximized social benefit from those tax dollars. So that means prioritizing projects and workers in affected communities potentially. We've seen the United States do similar things, and providing those key labor provisions like apprenticeship quotas and prevailing wage standards. We also support things like advancing a standardized clean procurement process that incentivize industrial carbonization and creating market conditions where Canadian industries become the preferred suppliers, which again, in turn, keeps good unionized jobs on Canadian soil. Things like community benefit agreements are another kind of policy tool that we can use to maximize the benefits of a given project in the community that it's taking place in. So here we are. Sort of some of the key takeaways from this series is that, it only takes a modest set of interventions to create meaningful benefits. We weren't able to model out the impacts of every single recommendation, the 26 recommendations that are presented in the report, but we know a few key pieces lead to better outcomes. So we know in the introduction of a really comprehensive and holistic plan could create really optimized, better outcomes for Canadians than we see today. The blueprint can serve as a basis for the dialogue of a Sustainable Jobs Partnership Council. So we hope that this Partnership Council, once struck, will take this ideas and build on them and refine them in a way that really has workers and industry and government operating together in order to, create a better plan for Canadians as we experience all these change and transition. And engaging workers and talking about what net zero actually means and making sure that they are being prioritized in the process is incredibly important to securing support for climate action. And that wraps up my piece, and I'll pass it back to our moderators.
Fantastic. Well, I guess I'll jump in, and I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much, Megan and Alex, for those great presentations and for the really impressive work that you're doing in this area. Of course, you referenced in your presentations about how the Sustainable Jobs Act very important piece of legislation, really deals predominantly in the sort of overarching federal scope. And you reference the importance of that's not where everything needs to happen. This needs to be a process that takes place, at every level. Of course, as local labor councils, we operate at the local and the regional level, our affiliates at the workplace level. And so I guess I'm curious about, are there mechanisms within the Sustainable Jobs Act that help to facilitate that downstream work that needs to happen at those other levels? Or is that really up to us? And any advice that you could give with regards to that?
So, I mean, that's a good question, Stefan, because I think the issues that the Sustainable Jobs Act is trying to tackle are sort of like these national framework pieces. I think the important thing will be that when these action plans are being written and being put in place, that they speak to the issues that workers are dealing with at provincial, territorial, but frankly at local, like at the most local levels. And I think it's a really important thing that the goal is set. And the goal is that the purpose of this act is to sort of foster and protect sustainable jobs, right? And it defines that, and it says what these things are, and it's like these sort of decent job standards that go along with that. The right to collectively bargain, and so I think that provides a helpful framework for workers in every part of the country. But I made mention at the end of my comments, like this doesn't start and end with this national piece of legislation, right? Like these transitions are happening. Frankly, transitions are already happening, and it is, it's going to come down to a whole swath of policies, but also bargaining to deal with that. So, on one hand, it's making sure that the transition sort of clauses get written into collective agreements, and those don't have to look like brand new things necessarily. Like you can run the gamut from having committees that deal with this at the workplace level to no layoff clauses, right? There are some things that are sort of like tried and true and that exist. Like when there were technology related clauses that people were bargaining in things like that. It's also labor code reforms, frankly, right? Megan made reference to this, and it's a section that we have in the report about, and this really does depend on what province you're in and what your provincial labor code is. But rights to sectoral bargaining, for example, would be a huge piece of, frankly, transition policy, even though it doesn't obviously present that. Or single step certification. There's a whole swath of labor code reforms that would make it easier for people to form a union, to join a union, that would make sure that jobs are environmentally sustainable, but it's a good job. Because what I think is the concerning thing is that we have low carbon jobs that also don't come with the quality standards that come along with them. And I think it's important to remember that, and I'm now playing a little bit so stop it. Is that climate action based on like maybe good. And if people see climate action as degrading their quality of life and their futures and their jobs, like it becomes a much tougher sell. Whereas if there's an opportunity in it, if job standards are protected, if retention's protected, things like that, it really that becomes a lot more. Much more direct path. And I'll just share like one interesting thing that we learned. It's not that shocking, but it's important to remember is these talking to folks behind the professors in this research project that we remember. And one that we're sitting with a guy who is probably in his early mid-20s, working alone, talking about how for him the biggest key is his pension perspective. That he was thinking about that early in his career. And so pension protection are also just transition policies, right? There's a huge amount about just protecting jobs, creating jobs, and making sure that when you do create jobs, it's good jobs. So that's why I was talking a little bit about these labor conditions policies. So, British Columbia has the benefit of the huge benefits sort of framework that we set up, and these things are always ready for improvement. But there's a lot of those, British Columbia is moving on some of these issues that bargaining is, for example, huge, good piece of labor policy. but good piece of sort of sustainable jobs, transition policy, that kind of thing.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think that's a good segue into another point too, which is I think another thing that we encounter, and I think you referenced encountering some of this in your conversations with workers and your research. I think Megan, you mentioned that there's some skepticism. I'm not talking about skepticism about climate change per se, but skepticism about the just transition amongst some workers in high carbon sectors of the economy. And a lot of it, I think, stems from exactly as you said just now, Alex. Anxiety, understandably, about pensions, incomes, supporting their families, right? And so, and yet we heard in your presentation, Megan, that really this is a path to more good jobs, right? In the longer term, and that this actually is something that can provide more opportunity, more opportunity for good family sustaining employment for workers in Canada. And so I think there's a disconnect that exists currently there with a lot of folks between that real opportunity and the perception of what's going to happen or what this means. And so, I guess I'm wondering from your work on this, any reflections on or any advice on, communicating with those types of workers about that in a way that that is successful, right? Because I think a lot of the data heavy stuff sometimes isn't, right? So curious on that.
Yeah, I can jump in here. I think, one of the things I tried to the way the reports are written and in this presentation is it's a lot of these things are going to happen anyway. And it's a really pivotal moment in order for Canada to capitalize on some of our national advantages when it comes to the clean energy transition. So that's why we talk about things like industrial policy. We want to see more investment in sectors where Canada really has a leg up. So we've seen new employers starting to build up battery manufacturing facilities. That really, puts us in a place where we can have a value add in order to, work with our international trade partners to make sure that we're, putting in the pieces of our economy that are going to benefit critical minerals, advancing different kinds of, methane reduction in the oil and gas sector. All of these interventions, all of these steps, all of these industrial policy pieces come together and work together to make sure that Canada's sort of like claiming its stake when it comes to these global supply chains. We also look at it from an energy security perspective, where we don't want to be relying on other countries to, have key parts of our energy systems being imported. So we want to create as much, domestic manufacturing, domestic supply chains for our own domestic energy creation that we can. And communicating that with workers is really important, right? Because a lot of there's perceptions about this being really within the realm of our control, and something like an oil and gas cap on the oil and gas sector is going to result in this devastating economic decline and collapse. Whereas in reality, the oil and gas sectors, we see the trends and layoffs and major declines in line with the global oil price. So that's really something that Canada doesn't play a role in setting. So how do we make sure that we're spending the money now to make sure that we can participate meaningfully as these things unfold, right? Like our customers for Canadian oil are majorly the United States, who has set some really ambitious climate commitments. They're making the transition to electric vehicles at a really accelerated rate. It's happening faster than most economists predicted it would. And so if, our main product isn't in demand anymore as from our customers, the United States, then, we need to start investing in other areas that we can provide those services and generate that GDP and economic benefit from. So hopefully workers start to see that, these things are so politicized, but it ultimately is about preparing for future investment, and it can be a much more positive conversation in that light. So a lot of these changes, again, like you know, automation, pace of change when it comes to technology, these are things we can model and predict and account for. And, you know, if we're doing it in a coordinated way, then we should see better outcomes than we see today.
I'm just going to jump in with something else, which is we in this project we did sort of focus groups and some interviews. Again, I sat in on one, and they were testing a bunch of the policy interventions. So like how sort of ranking importance of things. So wages, pensions, training, et cetera. And one of them was your union being involved. And the participant said, well, like, all these things are really important to me, but they're all underpinned by my union bargaining on my behalf. Right. There is a way, and this sort of comes back to the theme of the webinar today, which is the way that workers achieve these things is by collective bargaining and by, you know, social dialogue and sort of through tripartism, like basically being at the table, bargaining what this means, is how you have these benefits. And so that's sort of why I was sort of making the comment earlier that there are these tools that we have that we can go back to that are really, you know, that are bedrock for how we approach these things, right? You know, and workplaces change, and so, you know, we can bargain in what that means. We want to be sure that these new, like as I say, sort of new industries are unionized as well. That's how you make them good, safe jobs, right? And that's what is kind of going to underpin this whole project. And by project, I mean sort of like our reaching net zero milestones.
Yeah, absolutely. As they say, if you're not at the table, you might be on the menu, right? So it's so
Right.
important that workers who are going to be, you know, face the brunt of any impacts are there to be part of deciding how that looks and how folks are going to be protected, right? And I think that's what can build some faith in those that we were talking about, those who are skeptical of the process, to see that we are at the table, that we are part of that decision making, and that we're getting results. Megan, you mentioned battery manufacturing. That hit home. There was an announcement a couple months ago about a battery manufacturing plant opening here in Maple Ridge, where I live, and that was very exciting. And I'm curious around that a little bit in terms of, you know, how this model of tripartite just transition, how having a model like that might be able to encourage the investments that are needed, both public and private, in the economy to help this transition along. Any thoughts on that from your work?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one because we saw there's quite a lot of strike action in the United States, where certain employers were using this transition, or, you know, retooling some of their zero emission vehicles, their internal combustion engine manufacturing plants, and, you know, laying off workers while refitting these sectors to create zero emissions vehicles. So that's exactly the kind of thing we don't want to see. We are really happy to see these new investments and these new plants, but again, we see the importance of unions in that context, where there is the means for people to come together and you know, fight back against their employers and not use what can be a really, you know, positive job generating exercise to undermine the rights of workers, undermine the wages of workers. And so that's where, you know, when we talk about just transition or sustainable jobs policy, we really need to take this holistic perspective into account. So yes, we want to see these investments in new manufacturing processes, but what can the federal government or provincial governments do to make sure that workers aren't exploited in that process? And that's where, you know, our recommendations around labor code strengthening, and ensuring that there is that presence of unions when it comes to these workers or sorry, these new investments. We really want to see workers, you know, have a say in how these investments unfold. You know, we want to see governments sticking up for workers too when they're negotiating these major investments with places like Volkswagen, to make sure that there are those standards in place that will benefit communities and have those trickle-down effects and address things broader than the energy transition, like the affordability crisis. We don't want to see plants being opened up with really bad working conditions. And so again, that's why we need to look at these things from so many different prongs and different angles to really get the big picture, and it unfolds in such different scales. So it is a really complex question, but I think we have at least the start of what can be a framework to start advancing those conversations in a productive way through the blueprint. But I think there's lots more work and research to be done around it as well.
Debating whether we have time for one more question or not. Maybe if it's a quick one. You did mention looking at the successes in some other jurisdictions as part of your research, writing the paper, and it's just curious what examples we might go away and look at following from this webinar. What are some things we could do a little bit of looking into and have some examples up our sleeve for conversations where we need to show that this process can and does work.
So I'll start, if you don't mind, I'll take a swing at this, which is, it's important to remember that not every country looks exactly like Canada. We do have, we are unique in how the economy works, and our geography and our workforce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there are some important things to learn. And what other countries have done has been, some of them have been quite targeted. So one of the examples we looked at was the German coal transition, right? So that was one example. But then another example is the US IRA. And so you have different ways of coming at these issues. And so frankly, we stole some pieces from, in the report that the CLC worked on with co-authored with Pembina, we stole some pieces from the German coal transition, and we stole some pieces from the IRA because, for example, the IRA is like a lot of carrots, right? And one really interesting one that they put together in the IRA is something called the Energy Community Bonus, or Energy Community Benefit. I sort of goof on what the B is. It's bonus. Anyways, the way that particular piece of the tax code works is it says there is an investment tax credit for locating a low-emitting industry in a community that has been tied to a high-emitting industry. So for them, it's coal. And so they say if a new employer is locating in a coal community, there is a benefit for that. But the IRA doesn't really get into questions, say, around pension bridging. The German coal transition heavily got involved and engaged, and their government got involved in pension protections. So I think an important thing is to say there's pieces to look at from a lot of different countries. We did in the study that we did look at other like heavily industrialized economies that typically had, in fact, I think they all had either sort of federal or confederal arrangements. So they had the dynamics between states and provinces and the federal governments, or they were in some cases, part of the EU. So they had these sort of like multi-level government issues, because that is a huge issue in Canada is the way in which our provinces and federal government work together, or don't in some cases. But I would encourage folks to look at that first report, because it is kind of interesting, these different ways that countries have tackled it. But to give you a list of some of the comparators that we looked at Scotland and their Just Transition Commission. We looked at Denmark. We looked at Germany. We looked at Spain, and we looked at the United States. I don't think I might be forgetting one other. I'm not.
New Zealand too.
New Zealand, that's right. And so New Zealand was another example where they had like a commission that they set up, and it also incorporated their indigenous perspectives and sort of treaty rights as part of that, which is not, for example, baked into how Europe addressed just issues around transition. So there is there's a constellation of ways that other countries have dealt with this, and I think we should take a look at stealing the best parts as opposed to trying to replicate.
Wow, perfect timing. Thank you so much. So I'll close by thanking everyone who attended today. Just really appreciate this conversation. I know my takeaways are going to be that there's lots of opportunity, but we have to engage to take advantage of that opportunity. And we have to also be aware of the pitfalls, and that we can learn from other jurisdictions. So I would encourage folks, I think Megan led the Sustainable Jobs Blueprint 1. And Blueprint 2 was, I think, co-authored by Alex and Megan together. So folks, you can find that on the Pembina Institute's website. So some really great homework for everyone. So I'll start by thanking Megan Gordon of the Pembina Institute and Alex Callahan of the Canadian Labour Congress. Really appreciate very thoughtful, thought-provoking presentations today. And it helps us, I think, as working people and the members in our region to think about these things, to think about opportunity and how we make sure that workers aren't left behind in this conversation and left out in the cold. I want to thank, as always, our partners at the Vancouver District Labour Council, Stefan von Sychowski, for moderating the panel, and also the Sustainable Workforce Coalition, Andrew Williamson. And we're super excited to have ZEIC on board as the new home of the Sustainable Workforce Coalition. So that's the Zero Emissions Innovation Center. And just thank everyone again, and you'll be able to find this recording and look for future lunch and learns in this conversation that we're opening up with community and labor in our region. And so we'll have those links out for folks, and just thank everyone for their lunch, their noon hour. I think that's all. Thank yous. And I'm Janet Andrews of the New Westminster District Labour Council. Have a great afternoon.